Do you think your hands are worthy of touching this $500 tile? Clean it again with your own filthy shirt. The vicious shriek of Vivian tore through the absolute silence of the most magnificent mansion in Atlanta. She was the future billionaire's wife, and she made sure everyone knew it. If you looked down at the gleaming marble floor, you would see her. Maisie, a beautiful, sweet 3-year-old black girl. Her tiny hands were trembling violently. She was desperately hugging a mop that was twice her size. Tears were streaming down her small, innocent cheeks because she was paralyzed with fear. Her mother, the impoverished maid of this grand estate, was nowhere to be found. She had been deliberately locked away on the 3rd floor to clean a dusty storage room as a cruel punishment. Vivian smirked triumphantly. She was entirely drunk on the absolute power of her upper-class status. But this wicked woman could never have anticipated what was about to happen. The heavy oak door of the kitchen had just been pushed open. Nathaniel, the incredibly powerful self-made billionaire and the very man she was about to marry, was standing right there. He had been standing there long enough to witness every single ounce of her pure cruelty. In the next 60 seconds, this giant of a man would entirely obliterate her arrogant existence. Welcome back to the channel, beautiful people. If this is your first time joining our community, we are absolutely thrilled to have you here. This is your sanctuary for deeply emotional karma stories that will shake your perspective and remind you that true justice always prevails. Before we dive deep into today's intense drama, please drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from today. Now let us step back and look at how this suffocating nightmare truly began. Some of the most toxic individuals hide behind the most expensive designer smiles. Her name was Vivian Cole. By every superficial standard of the Atlanta elite, she was the absolute pinnacle of perfection. She was 29 years old, impeccably polished, and terrifyingly arrogant. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and instantly calculated the net worth of every single person breathing her air. Her wardrobe was an endless sea of cream-colored silk blouses and tailored blazers that cost more than a normal person's yearly rent. She attended exclusive charity galas just to pose for the cameras. She knew exactly how to manipulate the right social circles. And most importantly, she was engaged to Nathaniel Brooks. Nathaniel was 32 years old and a formidable force in the real estate tech industry. But unlike Vivian, he had started his life with absolutely nothing. He was raised in a cramped, freezing apartment in Ohio by a single mother. His mother had scrubbed hotel room toilets 6 days a week just to keep the electricity turned on. Nathaniel had clawed his way out of poverty through sheer willpower, sleepless nights, and an unshakable moral compass. He was a fierce businessman, but his core was genuinely and quietly kind. He had built his billion-dollar empire without ever stepping on the necks of the working class. He met Vivian at a high-profile fundraiser 2 years ago. She had carefully played the role of a generous, warm-hearted philanthropist. She had fooled him completely. For a man who spent his entire life fighting wars in the boardroom, Vivian felt like a peaceful harbor. He proposed to her under the starlight, believing he had found his equal. He was incredibly right about her sophisticated intellect. But he was devastatingly wrong about the darkness rotting inside her heart. The Brooks estate was a sprawling 4-acre sanctuary. It featured a stunning white colonial mansion, perfectly manicured lawns, and a massive oak tree shading the grand entrance. The household staff was a small, fiercely loyal family of misfits. There was Mr. Aber, the elderly groundskeeper with arthritis who loved the gardens like his own children. There was Rosario, the brilliant chef who treated everyone like royalty. And then there was Dra. Dra was a 26-year-old single mother who worked as the primary housekeeper. She was exhausted, deeply indebted, but incredibly hardworking. She had accepted this demanding job 18 months ago to keep a roof over her daughter's head. Nathaniel respected DRA immensely because she never complained and always treated his home with profound care. He knew exactly how hard it was to be a single mother carrying the weight of the world. That is precisely why he allowed DRA to bring her daughter to the estate whenever her cheap daycare fell through. That little girl was Maisie. Maisie had bright, curious brown eyes and a smile that could melt the coldest ice. She was the kind of child who would quietly sit in the corner with her coloring books, humming happily to herself. Nathaniel adored the kid. He explicitly told DRA that Maisie was always welcome in his home. Vivian had smiled perfectly when Nathaniel mentioned this arrangement. She had called it incredibly sweet and generous. But the moment Nathaniel left for his frequent business trips, the heavy mask of perfection violently slipped off Vivian's face. Have you ever gone to work and been forced to swallow your pride just to look at the incredibly arrogant face of someone who has less talent but vastly more privilege than you? If you have ever tasted the bitter poison of workplace humiliation, drop a number 1 in the comments right now to show your solidarity. Because DRA was living in a constant state of silent terror. The moment Vivian officially moved into the mansion, the air became thick, toxic, and dangerously oppressive. Vivian despised poverty. She viewed the working class as nothing more than disposable, invisible machines. But she harbored a special venomous disdain for little Maisie. To Vivian, the presence of a poor black child in her pristine multimillion-dollar living room was an unforgivable insult to her elite status. She felt that the very air she breathed was being contaminated by their lower-class existence. She would intentionally walk past the little girl with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. If Maisie accidentally left a single crayon on the patio, Vivian would dramatically summon DRA. She would cross her arms, tap her designer heels, and humiliate the exhausted mother for 10 straight minutes about basic hygiene and class boundaries. DRA swallowed her tears every single day. She desperately needed the paycheck to buy asthma medication for Maisie. She instructed her little girl to become completely invisible whenever the future madam of the house was nearby. But Vivian's cruelty was a hungry beast that demanded to be fed. She was not satisfied with just making them feel small. She wanted to break them entirely. The tension inside the mansion grew thicker and more unbearable with each passing week. Vivian began to systematically isolate DRA from the rest of the staff. She specifically banned Mr. Aber from bringing fresh strawberries to Maisie in the kitchen. She scolded Chef Rosario for offering the little girl leftover pastries, claiming it was a disgusting breach of professional boundaries. The grand mansion, which had once been filled with genuine warmth and laughter, slowly transformed into a sterile, terrifying prison. DRA's hands became rough and blistered from the excessive, pointless scrubbing Vivian demanded. Vivian would intentionally drop crumbs on the freshly vacuumed carpets just to watch DRA get on her hands and knees to clean it up again. It was a sick, twisted game of dominance. Vivian wanted to prove that no matter how kind Nathaniel was, she was the true ruler of this domain. She wanted DRA to deeply understand that she was nothing more than dirt beneath her expensive designer shoes. And she was meticulously laying the groundwork for a trap that would completely destroy DRA's life. A trap that involved her elite, incredibly snobbish circle of wealthy friends. The suffocating nightmare officially escalated into an orchestrated reign of terror on a dark, rainy Friday evening. Nathaniel was thousands of miles away, attending a crucial tech acquisition summit in London. With the master of the house gone, Vivian seized the absolute perfect opportunity to transform the peaceful mansion into her own personal theater of psychological cruelty. She decided to host an extremely exclusive, highly intimate dinner party for her inner circle of immensely wealthy, equally toxic socialites. Among these guests was Chloe. Chloe was the arrogant heir to a massive international shipping fortune. She was a woman whose heart was as incredibly cold and sharp as the multi-million-dollar diamonds dripping from her neck. Chloe was Vivian's ultimate mirror image. They were both dangerously intoxicated by the profound suffering of those they deemed entirely beneath them. The grand dining room was brilliantly illuminated by a massive, sparkling crystal chandelier. The incredibly long table was meticulously set with imported French porcelain and heavy antique silver cutlery. DRA had been forcefully commanded to work a grueling double shift. She was physically broken and profoundly exhausted. Her bones ached violently with every step she took. Little Maisie was quietly tucked away in the tiny damp staff break room in the back, tightly clutching a worn-out teddy bear. Vivian sharply rang a small, high-pitched silver bell, forcefully summoning DRA to pour the evening wine. It was an incredibly rare, exclusive vintage Bordeaux that cost substantially more than what DRA earned in an entire, agonizing year of hard labor. DRA carefully approached the dining table, her bruised hand shaking slightly from pure physical exhaustion. She flawlessly poured the dark ruby liquid into Vivian's crystal glass. Then she quietly moved over to Chloe's seat. As DRA gently leaned in to pour the wine, Chloe deliberately, with a chilling, calculated smirk on her face, forcefully slammed her elbow completely backward. The heavy crystal glass violently tipped over. The dark, thick blood-red wine splashed aggressively across the pristine, completely white priceless Persian rug. A collective, highly theatrical gasp echoed loudly through the lavish dining room. But Vivian did not look at the spreading red stain on the expensive floor. She stared directly and menacingly into DRA's terrified, panicked eyes. Her perfectly painted lips curled upward into a wicked, deeply satisfied smile. This was exactly the trap she had meticulously planned. Look exactly at what you have done, you incredibly clumsy, utterly useless creature, Vivian hissed aggressively, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. DRA's heart pounded violently against her fragile ribs. She immediately began apologizing profusely, her exhausted voice shaking with pure terror. "I am so incredibly sorry, Miss Cole. I swear it was an accident. I will get the heavy-duty carpet cleaner immediately." Vivian abruptly and aggressively stood up from her chair. Her expensive wooden chair screeched violently against the polished hardwood floor, silencing the entire room. "Absolutely not," Vivian commanded forcefully. "You will absolutely not use the cleaning machine. The heavy machine will completely ruin the delicate, priceless fibers of this imported rug. You will clean this terrible mess entirely on your knees. You will use your bare, filthy hands. You will use a small bristle brush and a bucket of freezing cold water. And you will absolutely not stop scrubbing until every single microscopic drop of that stain is completely and utterly erased from my sight." Chloe let out a high-pitched, incredibly cruel laugh, casually sipping from her backup glass of expensive champagne. "It is truly the only effective way these lower-class people ever learn their place. Darling," Chloe whispered loudly enough for the entire dining room to clearly hear and enjoy. DRA stood completely frozen in absolute shock. The profound, crushing humiliation of this cruel demand washed over her entirely like a wave of freezing, suffocating water. She was a living, breathing human being, not a disposable slave. But in that agonizing fraction of a second, she immediately thought of the severely overdue electricity bill sitting on her kitchen counter. She thought of the highly expensive asthma inhaler that little Maisie desperately needed before the harsh winter officially arrived. She swallowed her shattered pride. She slowly, painfully, and humiliatingly lowered her exhausted body down onto the cold, hard floor. She grabbed a small, rough bristle brush and began aggressively scrubbing the thick, soaked fibers of the expensive rug. The dark red wine deeply stained her bare hands, making them look violently bruised and completely bloody. The group of incredibly wealthy women sitting directly above her simply continued to eat their gourmet multi-course meal. They were entirely and comfortably ignoring the desperately weeping mother, who was literally scrubbing the floor right at their expensive shoes. They casually talked about their upcoming luxury ski vacations to Aspen and their brand new sports cars. They literally stepped over Dra's trembling body, as if she were a piece of rotting garbage on the street. Suddenly, the heavy wooden kitchen doors swung forcefully open. Chef Rosario and Mr. Aber, who had clearly heard the humiliating commotion, stepped bravely into the dining room. Rosario's weathered face turned completely bright red with absolute, uncontrollable fury when he saw Dra suffering on the floor. Mr. Aber fiercely gripped his worn-out gardening hat. His old jaw clenched so incredibly tightly it looked like the bones might actually snap. "Miss Cole," Rosario started speaking, his deep voice trembling noticeably with barely contained, righteous rage. "This is absolutely not right. This is completely inhumane. It was clearly an accident. I will bring the proper carpet cleaner right now." Vivian aggressively and sharply snapped her perfectly manicured fingers in the air, instantly and brutally cutting him off. Her cold eyes narrowed into deadly, deeply threatening slits. "If either of you worthless men takes one single step closer to her," Vivian whispered, her tone significantly colder than a brutal winter storm, "I will personally have you both violently thrown out onto the freezing street tonight. I will use my absolute power to personally make sure you are permanently blacklisted from every single wealthy household in this entire state. You will lose your precious pensions. You will lose your pathetic little homes. Do you absolutely understand my power?" The suffocating silence that instantly filled the massive room was completely deafening. Mr. Aber and Chef Rosario stood entirely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of her evil threat. They were older men. They had struggling families to financially support. They had heavy mortgages to pay off. This threat was absolutely not empty. Vivian possessed the immense, unchecked financial power to completely destroy their entire lives with one single casual phone call. Dra looked up at the two kind men from the floor. Hot, bitter tears were streaming uncontrollably down her exhausted face. But she desperately and silently shook her head, pleading with them through her eyes not to risk their entire livelihoods just to save her. She swallowed her absolute agony, lowered her head back down to the floor, and continued to scrub furiously. The intense physical pain tearing through her raw hands was absolutely nothing compared to the complete, devastating agony breaking her soul. She scrubbed the floor until her fragile skin was physically raw and actively bleeding. And tragically, through the small, slightly open crack in the kitchen door, little Maisie watched everything. The innocent 3-year-old black girl stood in the dark, watching her beloved mother being completely broken by the cruelest, most arrogant people on the face of the earth. The harsh, unforgiving morning sunlight violently pierced through the towering, custom-made stained glass windows of the grand mansion. It was the morning immediately following the utterly disastrous, humiliating dinner party. Deep inside the cramped, poorly ventilated staff quarters, Dra was awake long before the sun had fully risen. She sat on the edge of her thin, uncomfortable mattress, staring blankly at her destroyed hands. The skin on her knuckles was completely raw, peeled back, and aggressively inflamed from scrubbing the harsh chemicals into the Persian rug for 3 agonizing hours the previous night. Every single micro-movement of her fingers sent blinding, sickening waves of pure physical agony, shooting entirely up her exhausted arms. She meticulously wrapped cheap, rough white medical tape around her bleeding fingers, desperately trying to conceal the brutal damage. She absolutely could not let little Maisie see the violent physical toll this luxury prison was taking on her. Maisie slowly woke up, rubbing her sleepy brown eyes. The beautiful, innocent 3-year-old black girl looked up at her mother and immediately noticed the thick bandages. "Mommy, are you hurt?" Maisie whispered softly, her incredibly sweet voice filled with profound, genuine concern. Dra forced the most convincing, desperately fake smile she could possibly muster. She gently kissed her daughter's forehead, completely ignoring the sharp pain radiating from her own hands. "No, my sweet angel, Mommy just bumped into a heavy table. That is absolutely all," Dra lied smoothly, her heart shattering into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. Upstairs, the undisputed, terrifying tyrant of the house was just beginning her luxurious morning routine. Vivian Cole gracefully descended the grand, sweeping mahogany staircase. She was wearing a breathtakingly expensive, imported silk morning robe that flowed behind her like a royal cape. She casually sipped an organic, freshly pressed green juice prepared exactly to her microscopic specifications by the terrified chef Rosario. As Vivian strutted into the massive gourmet kitchen, she immediately spotted Dra standing near the massive marble island, struggling to wash the heavy breakfast dishes with her tightly bandaged hands. A dark, twisted, incredibly sick wave of absolute satisfaction washed completely over Vivian's cold heart. She deeply loved seeing the undeniable physical proof of her absolute dominance entirely stamped onto the bodies of the lower class. Suddenly, the sleek high-tech phone mounted on the kitchen wall rang loudly, shattering the tense, suffocating silence. Vivian aggressively snatched the receiver, instantly transforming her venomous, cold demeanor into a sickeningly sweet, entirely fake persona. It was Nathaniel, calling directly from his ultra-luxurious penthouse suite in London. "Good morning, my absolute love," Vivian purred smoothly into the phone, batting her eyelashes even though he could not see her. "I miss you so incredibly much. The massive house feels completely empty without your brilliant presence." Nathaniel's deep, steady, profoundly calm voice echoed through the expensive speaker. "I miss you too, Vivian. The tech acquisition is completely finalized. I should be flying back on the private jet in exactly 3 days." Vivian smiled triumphantly. 3 days. That was plenty of time to fully execute the rest of her vicious agenda. "By the way," Nathaniel continued, his tone shifting slightly into genuine, thoughtful concern, "could you please make absolutely sure that Chef Rosario prepares a very special extra warm soup for Dra today? And please check if Maisie needs a refill on her asthma medication before the cold front completely hits Atlanta. I want to make absolutely sure they are fully taken care of." The temperature in the massive kitchen instantly plummeted to absolute zero. Vivian's perfectly contoured face violently contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. Her knuckles turned entirely white as she gripped the expensive phone so tightly it almost cracked in half. "How absolutely dare he?" she screamed entirely inside her own mind. "How dare this billionaire, this master of industry, waste even one microscopic fraction of his precious brainpower thinking about a filthy lower-class maid and her entirely insignificant child?" To Vivian, Nathaniel's profound kindness was an absolute, unforgivable insult to her elite, upper-class supremacy. It made her feel entirely threatened. She forced herself to maintain the fake, sugary tone, practically choking on her own venom. "Of course, my darling. I am taking completely excellent care of them. You have absolutely nothing to worry about." She forcefully slammed the phone back onto the receiver, the exact millisecond the call ended. She aggressively turned around and glared fiercely at Dra, who was violently scrubbing a pot, completely unaware of the deadly conversation that had just occurred. Vivian's dark, manicured nails dug violently into her own palms. She realized in that exact terrifying moment that simply humiliating DRA was absolutely no longer enough. She needed to completely, permanently, and violently eradicate this lower-class disease from her pristine mansion. She immediately pulled out her diamond-encrusted smartphone and viciously dialed Chloe's private number. "Chloe, darling," Vivian hissed menacingly into the phone. "Cancel your incredibly expensive spa appointment immediately. Come to the estate right now. We have a massive absolute pest control problem that we need to permanently solve." Less than 30 minutes later, Chloe aggressively parked her roaring cherry-red Ferrari completely illegally across the manicured driveway. The two incredibly wealthy, entirely morally bankrupt women locked themselves inside the heavily soundproofed lavish sunroom. They viciously sipped incredibly rare mimosas while meticulously plotting the complete and total destruction of an innocent single mother. "I cannot simply fire her." Vivian aggressively paced back and forth across the expensive room. "Nathaniel is completely and utterly obsessed with his pathetic bleeding heart charity complex. If I terminate her contract without an absolutely bulletproof reason, he will launch a massive investigation. He might even financially compensate her." Chloe let out a high-pitched, incredibly cruel mocking laugh. "You are overthinking this completely, darling. These lower-class rats are all exactly the same. They are entirely driven by their pathetic desperation. You simply need to expose her true, criminal nature to Nathaniel." Vivian stopped pacing abruptly. Her cold eyes locked entirely onto Chloe. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Vivian demanded sharply. Chloe slowly and dramatically reached into her incredibly expensive designer handbag. She deliberately pulled out a small, stunningly beautiful, blindingly flawless 5-carat diamond ring. It was a priceless, irreplaceable family heirloom that belonged entirely to Vivian's late grandmother. "You conveniently leave this magnificent piece of absolute perfection lying around the master bathroom," Chloe whispered maliciously, her eyes gleaming with pure demonic excitement. "And then, when it tragically and mysteriously goes entirely missing, who is the absolutely only person with full, unrestricted access to those private rooms?" A slow, completely terrifying, immensely evil smile violently stretched across Vivian's face. "The incredibly desperate, totally broke maid with a sick child to feed." Vivian finished the sentence, completely intoxicated by the sheer brilliance of the vicious trap. "Nathaniel absolutely despises liars and thieves above everything else in the world," Vivian said excitedly, her heart racing with pure malice. "If he believes she completely betrayed his profound trust and stole from my family, he will not just fire her. He will personally and forcefully throw her and that filthy little child entirely out onto the freezing streets. He will utterly destroy her capacity to ever find employment again." The two elite women clinked their crystal champagne flutes violently together, entirely celebrating the impending, absolute ruin of a completely innocent woman. Downstairs in the tiny damp laundry room, DRA continued to painstakingly fold the massive pile of expensive silk sheets. Her bandaged hands were actively bleeding through the cheap white tape, but she kept completely silent. Little Maisie sat quietly in the dark corner, drawing a beautifully colorful picture of a big, happy sun. They were entirely and completely unaware that a massive, inescapable, completely devastating guillotine had just been meticulously hoisted directly over their fragile necks. Exactly at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the vicious trap was violently set into motion. Vivian Cole completely abandoned her luxurious upper floor and quietly crept down the narrow, dimly lit servants' hallway. She violently pinched her perfect, extremely expensive nose in absolute disgust at the faint smell of cheap laundry detergent and hard labor that permanently lingered in the cold air. She aggressively pushed open the heavy wooden door to the cramped, completely miserable staff locker room. Her cold, calculating eyes immediately locked onto DRA's pathetic, utterly worn-out canvas tote bag resting on a broken wooden bench. Vivian pulled the blindingly flawless, incredibly expensive 5-carat diamond ring from her designer pocket using a pristine white silk handkerchief. She absolutely refused to let her wealthy fingerprints touch the cheap fabric of the maid's bag. With a sickeningly wicked, entirely triumphant smile, she deliberately dropped the priceless family heirloom deep inside the dark bag. The massive sparkling diamond landed directly next to little Maisie's cheap, heavily used plastic asthma inhaler. The sheer, undeniable physical contrast between the multi-million-dollar jewel and the desperate, life-saving medical device of a poor black child was absolutely staggering. Vivian turned around gracefully and walked back upstairs, preparing to deliver the absolute performance of her entire life. Exactly 20 minutes later, a terrifying, high-pitched, incredibly theatrical scream violently shattered the peaceful silence of the grand mansion. "Someone call the police immediately. My grandmother's priceless diamond ring has been completely stolen." Vivian shrieked at the absolute top of her lungs from the massive, sweeping grand staircase. Her voice was deeply laced with fake, entirely manufactured panic and immense, aggressive outrage. The entire household staff completely froze in absolute, undeniable terror. Mr. Aber dropped his heavy gardening shears directly onto the grass, his old heart pounding violently against his chest. Chef Rosario immediately abandoned the boiling gourmet soup on the expensive stove and rushed directly toward the grand foyer. DRA came running desperately from the third-floor guest bedrooms, completely out of breath, her bandaged hands shaking uncontrollably. Vivian stood aggressively at the very center of the pristine marble floor, her expensive silk robe flowing around her like a terrifying royal executioner. Chloe was lounging comfortably on the velvet sofa nearby, casually sipping a hot cup of imported Earl Grey tea, watching the devastating human suffering like it was an incredibly entertaining reality television show. "We have an absolutely disgusting, unforgivable thief living inside this very house," Vivian aggressively announced, completely locking her cold, deadly eyes entirely onto DRA. The absolute silence that immediately followed was suffocating, heavy, and completely terrifying. DRA's exhausted, fragile body began to tremble violently as the horrific realization of the brutal accusation entirely washed over her. "Miss Cole, I swear to God no one here would ever touch your belongings," DRA whispered desperately, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated fear. "Shut your filthy, lying mouth right this second," Vivian screamed forcefully, violently stepping directly into DRA's personal space. "You are the absolutely only disgusting creature in this entire mansion desperate enough to steal. I demand that every single piece of your pathetic belongings be forcefully searched this exact instant." Before DRA could even physically process the vicious command, Vivian aggressively ordered the massive private security guards to retrieve DRA's worn-out bag from the locker room. The large, intimidating guard forcefully slammed the cheap canvas bag directly onto the pristine multi-million-dollar kitchen island. "Empty it right now, you disgusting thief," Vivian commanded with a completely evil, deeply satisfied smirk. DRA's breathing became incredibly shallow and completely erratic. She painfully unzipped the cheap bag with her raw, bleeding, heavily bandaged fingers. Tears of absolute humiliation and pure, undeniable terror streamed uncontrollably down her exhausted face. She slowly pulled out a cheap, half-empty bottle of generic lotion. She pulled out a crumpled, heavily worn city bus pass. She pulled out little Maisie's vital, life-saving asthma inhaler. And then the heavy bag tipped slightly forward. The incredibly massive, blindingly bright 5-carat diamond ring fell forcefully out of the bag. It hit the expensive marble countertop with a sharp, undeniable, completely devastating clink. A collective horrified gasp violently erupted from the gathered staff members. Ray's eyes widened to the absolute size of saucers, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated horror of the impossible situation. No, 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 I swear to you I have absolutely never seen that ring in my entire life. Dra screamed hysterically, aggressively backing away from the kitchen island. Someone placed it inside my bag. I am entirely innocent. Vivian let out a loud, incredibly cruel, completely victorious laugh that echoed violently off the high ceilings. Do you honestly expect me to believe your pathetic lower-class lies? Vivian hissed aggressively, her face twisting into a mask of pure, undeniable hatred. You are a filthy, disgusting criminal. I am going to completely destroy your entire pathetic life. I am calling the heavily armed police this exact second, and they will forcefully drag you directly to a freezing prison, and that disgusting little child of yours will be violently thrown directly into the foster care system. The absolute mention of losing little Maisie completely shattered Dra's fragile soul. She aggressively threw her exhausted, heavily bruised body directly onto the cold, hard marble floor. She violently grabbed Vivian's expensive designer shoes, weeping hysterically, begging for her entire life. Please, I beg of you, do whatever you want to me, but absolutely do not take my little baby away. Dra sobbed violently, completely abandoning every single ounce of her human dignity to protect her innocent child. Chloe laughed loudly again, completely entirely entertained by the desperate mother's absolute misery. But just as Vivian reached triumphantly for her expensive smartphone to completely finalize Dra's absolute destruction, a deep, incredibly firm, entirely commanding voice echoed aggressively through the massive kitchen. Put the phone down immediately, Miss Cole. Everyone turned around in absolute shock. Chef Rosario had forcefully stepped entirely out of the shadows, his weathered face completely hard and absolutely devoid of any fear. What absolutely insane nonsense are you spewing, you pathetic cook? Vivian demanded aggressively, her cold eyes flashing with pure, deadly venom. Rosario did not back down even a single millimeter. He calmly walked directly over to the wall-mounted security intercom system. He crossed his massive, muscular arms defensively across his broad chest. Mr. Brooks ordered a completely brand new, highly advanced, ultra-high-definition security camera to be installed in the servants' hallway just yesterday afternoon, Rosario stated with absolute, undeniable authority. He specifically wanted to ensure the staff's personal belongings were entirely safe from outside contractors. The terrifying temperature in the massive room instantly plummeted to absolute zero. Vivian's perfectly contoured face turned completely, undeniably, violently pale. The camera points directly at the door of the staff locker room. Rosario continued entirely mercilessly, his voice echoing loudly. If Dra truly stole that expensive ring, the high-definition footage will show her completely sneaking into the room. But if someone else secretly planted it there, the camera will absolutely expose their exact identity to Mr. Brooks. Should we immediately call Mr. Brooks in London and ask him to review the live cloud footage right now? The suffocating silence that entirely enveloped the kitchen was completely deafening. Vivian's heart completely stopped beating inside her chest. She had absolutely no idea the new camera existed. If Nathaniel saw the undeniable, crystal-clear footage of her maliciously sneaking into the servants' quarters, her glorious billionaire wedding would be completely, violently, and permanently cancelled. Her entire wealthy, elite social standing would be entirely obliterated overnight. Vivian's perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently with pure, suppressed absolute rage. She viciously grabbed the heavy diamond ring from the marble counter. She aggressively glared at Dra, who was still weeping completely uncontrollably on the floor. And then she glared entirely at Chef Rosario with the absolute hatred of 1,000 burning suns. It appears there has been a massive, completely unbelievable misunderstanding. Vivian forced the words out through violently gritted teeth, practically choking on her own venomous pride. She forcefully spun around, her expensive silk robe whipping aggressively through the tense air, and viciously stormed entirely out of the kitchen with Chloe completely rushing right behind her. She had entirely failed to successfully frame the innocent maid. But the immense burning humiliation of being completely outsmarted by a lower-class cook absolutely drove Vivian entirely into true, unadulterated madness. She immediately swore to herself that she would completely and physically punish Dra. And that filthy little black child in a way that no security camera could ever possibly capture. The suffocating heavy gloom of the weekend arrived with an entirely new, deeply terrifying atmosphere hanging violently over the massive estate. Vivian Cole had spent the entire, agonizing night pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rugs in her ultra-luxurious multi-million-dollar master suite. She was completely, utterly consumed by the burning, deeply humiliating reality of her completely failed setup. She painfully realized that attempting to illegally frame Dra for grand theft was entirely too risky now, especially with Nathaniel's brand new, highly advanced, hidden security cameras constantly monitoring the servants' quarters. But Vivian was an absolute, undisputed master of brutal psychological warfare. If she could not legally, officially fire the impoverished maid, she would physically and emotionally break her entirely until she voluntarily walked out into the freezing streets. And the most highly effective, completely devastating, undeniably evil way to permanently break a desperate, struggling single mother was to violently target her innocent, entirely defenseless child. Early Saturday morning, the massive, sprawling mansion was eerily, terrifyingly quiet. Nathaniel was still officially scheduled to be in London for 2 more entirely agonizing days. Vivian meticulously and wickedly orchestrated her ultimate, unforgivable revenge. She gracefully descended the grand staircase and approached Chef Rosario in the massive kitchen. She aggressively handed him an absurdly long, highly specific, completely ridiculous list of imported, exotic ingredients that could absolutely only be found at a rare specialty market exactly 3 towns over. She violently ordered him to leave the premises immediately, threatening his entire pension if he was even 1 single minute late. Then she viciously commanded the elderly Mr. Aber to manually clear the massive, heavy, incredibly thorny bushes at the absolute furthest, most completely isolated edge of the massive 4-acre property. Within exactly 1 hour, the 2 fiercely protective, kind-hearted men were completely, forcefully removed from the main house. The protective shield was entirely gone. Next, Vivian aggressively summoned Dra. Dra's fragile hands were still heavily bandaged, actively bleeding through the cheap white tape, and her incredibly dark, exhausted eyes were completely sunken from another agonizing, entirely sleepless night of pure, undeniable anxiety. Vivian pointed her extremely sharp, expensively manicured designer finger directly toward the sweeping, incredibly high mahogany staircase. There is a massive, incredibly filthy, completely abandoned storage room on the absolute top floor of the West Wing, Vivian hissed coldly, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. It has absolutely not been cleaned in over a solid decade. It is completely filled with incredibly heavy, completely dust-covered antique furniture, and highly toxic black mold. You will go entirely up there this exact second. You will absolutely not come down, you will not eat a single piece of food, And you will not drink one single microscopic drop of water until every single inch of that massive room is completely, undeniably immaculate. Dear Ray's exhausted heart plummeted violently, entirely into the bottom of her stomach. But Miss Cole, my little Maisie, Dra pleaded desperately, her fragile voice trembling violently with genuine, absolute terror. The disgusting little child will stay exactly downstairs, Vivian snapped aggressively, her terrifying tone leaving absolutely zero room for any human negotiation. If you refuse this direct, official command from the future madam of this house, I will call the employment agency right this exact second and personally ensure you are permanently, completely blacklisted for severe insubordination. You and your filthy brat will starve on the streets. Dra had absolutely no choice. She was entirely trapped in a vicious, inescapable cycle of extreme poverty. She knelt down and kissed her beautiful, incredibly sweet 3-year-old daughter softly on the forehead, desperately promising the little girl she would be back as soon as humanly possible. Dra then painfully, agonizingly climbed the steep, endless stairs to her dusty, suffocating, completely locked prison. Now the terrifying, entirely evil trap was completely and perfectly set. The massive, incredibly silent, multi-million-dollar mansion was entirely empty, except for the soft, innocent, deeply sweet humming of little Maisie. The beautiful young black girl was sitting quietly on the pristine, incredibly cold marble kitchen floor, happily playing with a small, heavily worn-out, cheap coloring book. Vivian gracefully, completely silently pushed open the heavy wooden kitchen door. She looked directly down at the tiny, entirely innocent child with an expression of pure, unadulterated, blinding, completely racist disgust. She absolutely hated the undeniable fact that this poor, lower-class minority child was breathing her expensive elite air. Vivian slowly, menacingly walked over to the massive utility closet and violently, aggressively pulled out a heavy, incredibly thick, industrial-sized wooden mop. It was completely soaked with freezing cold, incredibly dirty, entirely foul-smelling water from the previous day's deep cleaning. Vivian forcefully, violently dropped the massive, incredibly heavy mop directly in front of the tiny 3-year-old child. The incredibly loud, aggressive smack of the soaking wet mop violently hitting the highly expensive marble floor caused Maisie to aggressively, violently flinch. The tiny little girl slowly looked up, her incredibly large, beautiful brown eyes completely wide with pure, innocent confusion and deep, undeniable absolute fear. "Get up immediately," Vivian commanded aggressively, her completely cold voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly, entirely venomous whisper. Maisie's tiny, innocent lower lip began to tremble violently. She was absolutely only 3 years old. She did not fully comprehend the incredibly complex, completely evil dynamics of extreme class wealth and pure hatred, but she entirely deeply understood the incredibly terrifying, dangerous tone of a highly aggressive adult. She slowly, shakily, and entirely fearfully stood up on her tiny, completely barefoot little feet. "Your completely useless, absolutely pathetic, lower-class mother missed a massive spot on my incredibly expensive floor," Vivian hissed aggressively, viciously pointing her extremely sharp, incredibly dangerous designer nail directly at the child's terrified, tear-filled face. "Since your pathetic mother is too incredibly stupid and completely incompetent to do her filthy job, you are going to forcefully finish it entirely for her. Pick up the heavy mop right this exact second." Maisie looked down at the massive, incredibly heavy wooden handle. It was literally undeniably twice as tall as her tiny, fragile little body. It was completely soaked and impossibly entirely heavy. The little girl's incredibly small dark hands reached out highly hesitantly, her tiny, incredibly weak fingers struggling violently just to wrap entirely around the thick, rough, incredibly unforgiving wood. I said mop the floor, you filthy, disgusting little rat. Vivian screamed aggressively, the sheer, completely terrifying volume of her vicious, highly abusive voice violently echoing off the highly expensive, completely pristine marble walls. Hot, completely heartbreaking tears began streaming entirely uncontrollably down Maisie's soft, incredibly innocent cheeks. Her tiny, highly fragile arms shook violently and uncontrollably as she desperately, entirely fearfully tried to aggressively push the heavy, completely soaked mop across the massive floor. It was a physically entirely impossible task for a completely innocent toddler. She aggressively slipped slightly on the wet, highly polished marble, falling completely hard onto her extremely small, highly fragile knees. The freezing cold, incredibly dirty water completely soaked entirely through her cheap, incredibly worn-out little dress. Do you honestly think your filthy, disgusting hands are worthy of touching this $500 tile? Clean it entirely again with your own filthy shirt. Vivian screamed aggressively, displaying a completely wicked, utterly deranged, highly victorious, entirely evil smirk. She was completely intoxicating herself with the absolute, entirely unchecked power she violently held over this incredibly innocent, deeply terrified, entirely defenseless minority child. But the massive universe has an incredibly profound, absolute, completely undeniable way of entirely delivering highly poetic justice at the exact, highly specific moment the terrifying darkness feels entirely, completely inescapable. What the incredibly arrogant Vivian Cole absolutely did not know, what she could not have possibly, entirely anticipated in her completely blind, highly arrogant rage, was that Nathaniel Brooks had completely, entirely hated the massive London acquisition deal. He had forcefully finalized the massive multi-billion-dollar contract, a full 48 hours completely early. He had immediately boarded his incredibly massive, private, ultra-luxurious jet in the complete middle of the night, entirely desperate to deeply return to the quiet, highly peaceful sanctuary of his massive home. He had completely intentionally not called a private, highly expensive chauffeur from the massive airport. He had taken a quiet, entirely discreet, highly regular cab, because he deeply wanted to entirely surprise his beautiful, highly sophisticated fiancée. Right at that exact, highly terrifying, completely pivotal moment, the massive billionaire Nathaniel Brooks was quietly, completely silently walking directly through the side entrance of his own massive mansion. The incredibly heavy, entirely solid oak door of the kitchen was just slightly, barely ajar. He completely, violently froze entirely in his tracks. His entire massive, highly muscular body turned entirely to solid stone as he looked directly through the small, narrow crack in the heavy door. He clearly saw the beautiful woman he was officially supposed to marry, the highly elegant, supposedly incredibly generous, highly sophisticated Vivian Cole. She was aggressively, violently screaming at a heavily sobbing, entirely freezing, utterly terrified 3-year-old minority child who was desperately, entirely fearfully trying to push a massive, incredibly heavy mop across the cold floor. The absolute, completely deafening silence that violently followed inside Nathaniel's incredibly sharp mind was the exact sound of a massive billion-dollar empire entirely, completely shifting its entire gravity. The horrific, completely undeniable, entirely brutal truth was completely laid violently bare before his very own eyes. The absolute timer on Vivian Cole's highly arrogant, completely cruel, entirely evil existence had just aggressively, permanently hit absolute zero. The incredibly heavy, completely solid oak door of the massive gourmet kitchen did not just simply open. It was violently, aggressively pushed entirely wide open. The massive, heavy brass hinges groaned loudly, completely shattering the terrifying, suffocating silence of the room. Vivian Cole violently whipped her perfectly contoured face around, her expensive silk morning robe twirling aggressively behind her. The highly malicious, entirely evil, completely victorious smirk that had been permanently plastered across her face instantly, violently melted entirely away. It was forcefully replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated, blinding, completely catastrophic panic. Nathaniel Brooks, the multi-billionaire titan of the tech and real estate industry, stood completely frozen in the massive doorway. He was dressed in a highly expensive, flawlessly tailored dark charcoal suit from his massive London meetings. But his incredibly sharp, deeply analytical eyes were not looking at his beautiful elite fiancée. They were completely, entirely locked onto the tiny, heavily sobbing, entirely freezing 3-year-old child kneeling desperately on the cold, wet marble floor. The incredibly heavy, completely soaked wooden mop forcefully slipped from little Maisie's tiny, violently trembling hands. It hit the highly expensive, perfectly polished marble floor with a massive, deafening, entirely catastrophic thud. The freezing, filthy water splashed entirely across Vivian's incredibly expensive multi-thousand-dollar designer slippers. But for the absolute first time in her entire highly privileged, completely arrogant life, Vivian absolutely did not care about her expensive shoes. Her entire wealthy heart completely stopped beating. Her perfectly manicured, highly expensive hands began to shake violently, entirely uncontrollably. "Nathaniel, my absolute love," Vivian aggressively stammered, her typically smooth, incredibly confident, highly manipulative voice completely cracking with pure, undeniable, absolute terror. You are entirely home so incredibly early. We absolutely did not expect your brilliant presence until tomorrow." Nathaniel absolutely did not speak. He did not aggressively scream. He did not violently yell. The absolute terrifying silence radiating entirely from his massive, highly muscular body was vastly, undeniably more completely terrifying than any loud, aggressive explosion could ever possibly be. He slowly, highly deliberately walked entirely into the massive kitchen. Each of his heavy, highly authoritative footsteps echoed violently off the massive, soaring ceilings like the terrifying rhythmic ticking of a massive, completely inescapable time bomb. He completely, entirely ignored Vivian. He forcefully walked directly past the incredibly wealthy, highly elite woman as if she were completely, undeniably invisible. As if she were an absolute, completely worthless ghost entirely haunting his beautiful home. He stopped directly in front of the tiny, deeply terrified, heavily sobbing 3-year-old child. Nathaniel slowly, incredibly gently lowered his massive, highly intimidating frame entirely down onto one knee. His highly expensive, completely flawless multi-thousand-dollar suit pants directly touched the freezing, completely filthy, incredibly dirty puddle of mop water. He absolutely did not care. He gently, incredibly softly reached out his massive, highly capable hands and carefully lifted little Maisie entirely off the freezing cold floor. The tiny, heavily sobbing child instinctively, completely desperately wrapped her incredibly fragile, highly trembling little arms directly around his massive, broad neck. She buried her completely tear-stained, entirely innocent little face directly into his expensive, highly tailored silk tie, weeping violently, completely uncontrollably into his chest. Nathaniel gently, highly protectively wrapped his massive arms entirely around the tiny, completely freezing child. He held her incredibly close, providing her with immediate, absolute, undeniable safety. He stood back up, holding the tiny, entirely innocent girl completely securely against his massive chest. Only then did he finally slowly turn his entirely cold, completely dead, terrifyingly sharp eyes directly toward Vivian. What exactly entirely and completely is happening in my house? Nathaniel asked quietly. His deep, highly commanding voice was incredibly low, completely devoid of any human emotion, entirely sharp and utterly deadly. Vivian's entire elite, highly privileged, completely arrogant world began to violently, uncontrollably collapse entirely around her. She desperately, highly aggressively scrambled to completely reconstruct her perfect, highly manipulative facade. Darling, please, you must absolutely understand, she aggressively pleaded, stepping entirely forward, her hands reaching out desperately to touch his expensive suit. It was entirely just a completely innocent little game. The filthy, completely incompetent maid entirely missed a massive spot, and the child was simply playfully pretending to help. Nathaniel's terrifyingly cold, deeply analytical eyes narrowed violently into tiny, completely deadly slits. A game, he repeated the word entirely flatly, the sheer, absolute disgust in his deep voice practically vibrating completely through the massive room. You violently forced a completely innocent, tiny 3-year-old child to push an industrial-sized, highly heavy, completely soaked mop across a freezing marble floor. As a game? She is completely entirely fine. Vivian screamed aggressively, her absolute panic violently overtaking her completely calculated composure. These lower-class, entirely poverty-stricken people are completely used to hard physical labor. Her filthy, completely disgusting mother is absolutely entirely lazy and highly insubordinate. I was simply absolutely teaching the pathetic child the undeniable, complete value of hard work. Nathaniel stared directly at her. He stared completely and entirely at the incredibly beautiful, highly polished, absolutely terrifying monster he had almost permanently chained his entire life to. He immediately violently remembered his own incredibly poor, highly exhausted, deeply struggling mother. He violently remembered the wealthy, highly arrogant, completely elite hotel managers who used to aggressively scream at his mother, entirely treating her like absolute, completely disposable garbage just because she wore a cheap maid's uniform to clean their luxurious messes. Where is Dra? Nathaniel demanded aggressively, his deeply commanding voice instantly turning completely, entirely to absolute, undeniable ice. Vivian aggressively swallowed hard, her completely dry throat violently closing entirely up. She is completely busy doing her official job. I asked you exactly where she is, Vivian, Nathaniel commanded violently, stepping entirely forward, his massive, highly intimidating presence completely overwhelming her entirely fragile, highly arrogant ego. I sent her entirely up to the massive storage room on the absolutely abandoned 3rd floor of the West Wing, Vivian whispered aggressively, completely unable to lie to his terrifying, entirely piercing gaze. I completely locked the massive door. I specifically ordered her absolutely not to come down until it was entirely, completely spotless. A massive, deeply dangerous, completely uncontrollable muscle ticked violently inside Nathaniel's incredibly sharp jawline. He had absolutely heard enough. He gently shifted little Maisie entirely into one massive arm, deeply comforting the tiny, entirely traumatized child. With his other massive, completely steady hand, he aggressively pulled his highly expensive smartphone directly from his pocket. He violently pressed a single button, instantly connecting entirely to his massive, highly trained private security team stationed directly at the massive front gates. This is Nathaniel, he commanded aggressively into the phone, his incredibly powerful voice entirely echoing through the massive mansion. I need 4 fully armed security personnel directly inside the main house this exact complete second. Bring absolutely massive packing boxes. Escort Miss Cole directly to the master suite. You will give her exactly 15 completely agonizing minutes to violently throw all of her entirely expensive, utterly pathetic belongings directly into the boxes. Vivian's mouth dropped completely, entirely open in pure, unadulterated, blinding, completely catastrophic horror. Nathaniel! No, you absolutely cannot do this to me. I am your completely beautiful, entirely official fiancé. We belong entirely to the exact same elite social class. Nathaniel completely ignored her violent, aggressive screaming. He looked directly into the security camera in the massive hallway, and absolutely ensure she does not steal a single microscopic item that I personally entirely paid for. When the 15 minutes are completely up, you will forcefully physically escort her entirely off my massive property. If she aggressively resists, violently call the absolute authorities and formally charge her with severe criminal trespassing. Nathaniel! Vivian shrieked violently, dropping entirely, heavily onto her expensive knees on the freezing, completely wet floor, completely abandoning her entire elite, highly arrogant dignity. Please. I absolutely love you. You absolutely love my money, my massive power, and your entirely pathetic elite status, Nathaniel stated completely coldly, violently turning his back entirely on her. You are completely, undeniably disgusting. Your absolutely entire, highly arrogant existence entirely ends right here. Never absolutely ever speak my complete name again. Without giving her even one single, completely microscopic ounce of further attention, Nathaniel walked aggressively, completely purposefully out of the massive kitchen, securely holding the tiny, entirely innocent child against his chest. He was marching entirely violently straight toward the highest floor of the mansion to completely rescue a terrified, entirely broken mother from her dark, suffocating prison. The massive, incredibly heavy mahogany staircase seemed to stretch entirely on forever, as Nathaniel Brooks aggressively took the steps two at a time. His highly muscular, incredibly powerful frame was entirely focused on one single absolute mission. Tucked completely safely against his expensive, flawlessly tailored charcoal suit jacket was the tiny, heavily traumatized, entirely freezing body of little Maisie. The 3-year-old child had completely buried her tear-stained face deep into his broad shoulder, her tiny, fragile hands fiercely gripping the expensive silk fabric of his lapel, as if he were the absolute only safe harbor in a completely terrifying, highly violent world. As Nathaniel violently pushed through the heavy wooden doors leading to the entirely abandoned third floor of the West Wing, the pristine, ultra-luxurious atmosphere of the massive mansion completely disappeared. The air up here was incredibly stale, completely suffocating, and highly toxic. Thick, heavy layers of ancient dust entirely covered the incredibly dark, narrow hallway. The absolute, undeniable cruelty of Vivian Cole's vicious command became completely, horrifyingly clear to the furious billionaire. She had intentionally, maliciously sent a desperate, highly exhausted single mother into a literal, undeniable toxic hazard zone. At the absolute, entirely furthest end of the incredibly dark corridor, Nathaniel saw it. A massive, incredibly heavy solid oak door, completely secured from the outside with a highly thick, heavy brass deadbolt. From entirely behind the thick wood, he could barely hear the faint, incredibly desperate, completely heartbreaking sounds of violent, agonizing physical labor. He could hear the highly frantic, completely panicked scrubbing of a harsh bristle brush violently tearing against old rotting wood. And beneath that terrible, highly mechanical sound, he could hear the soft, completely devastated, incredibly helpless weeping of a terrified mother who was absolutely desperate to get back to her child. Nathaniel's massive, highly powerful jaw clenched so incredibly tightly, it looked like solid, absolute granite. He gently, highly protectively shifted little Maisie entirely into his left arm. With his right hand he violently, aggressively grabbed the heavy brass deadbolt. He viciously twisted it open with such massive, uncontrollable force that the heavy metal mechanism completely snapped and groaned in absolute protest. He violently pushed the heavy oak door entirely open. The highly toxic, completely blinding cloud of black mold and ancient dust violently hit his face, but he absolutely did not blink. His incredibly sharp, entirely furious eyes immediately found Dra. The young, heavily exhausted, completely broken single mother was violently on her knees in the absolute center of the incredibly filthy, completely massive room. She was desperately, aggressively scrubbing the rotting, incredibly toxic floorboards. When the heavy door violently slammed open, Dra violently flinched, curling her fragile body entirely inward as if she was expecting another highly aggressive, completely vicious physical blow. "Please. I am scrubbing as completely fast as I absolutely can," Dra screamed desperately, her highly exhausted, completely terrified voice cracking violently with pure, undeniable panic. "Please do not hurt my little baby. I am almost entirely done." Nathaniel felt a massive, completely overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated physical nausea violently wash over his entire soul. He looked directly at her hands. The cheap, rough white medical tape she had used to completely bandage her severely injured fingers was now entirely violently soaked in dark, fresh red blood. Her beautiful, fragile skin was completely, undeniably torn to absolute shreds from the highly aggressive, utterly pointless labor. "Dra," Nathaniel said softly, his deep, highly commanding voice completely dropping into an incredibly gentle, entirely safe, highly comforting whisper. "It is entirely over. You can completely stop now." Dra slowly, highly fearfully turned her heavily weeping, completely exhausted face toward the massive doorway. Her incredibly dark, deeply sunken eyes violently widened in absolute, complete disbelief. She did not see the terrifying, highly aggressive Vivian Cole. She saw the massive, multi-billionaire master of the house, looking entirely at her with completely undeniable, absolute human compassion. And then she saw the tiny, entirely safe, completely protected little girl resting securely in his massive arms. "Mommy!" Little Maisie cried out softly, her tiny, incredibly sweet voice completely shattering the toxic, heavy silence of the dark room. Dra violently dropped the harsh bristle brush. She completely ignored the blinding, absolute agony violently tearing through her completely bloody hands. She aggressively scrambled across the filthy, incredibly toxic floor, entirely sobbing with completely uncontrollable absolute relief. Nathaniel gently, highly carefully lowered the tiny child directly down. Maisie violently ran into her completely exhausted mother's fragile arms. The incredibly powerful, deeply emotional reunion between the terrified mother and her completely innocent child absolutely echoed through the empty, massive hallway, completely breaking the heart of the incredibly powerful billionaire watching them. "I am so incredibly, profoundly sorry, Dra," Nathaniel whispered heavily, completely dropping entirely down onto one knee right there in the filthy, highly toxic dirt, completely ignoring his expensive designer suit. He looked directly into the deeply terrified, entirely broken eyes of the lower-class maid. "No human being should ever, absolutely ever be subjected to this complete, undeniable level of absolute cruelty in my home. You are entirely safe now. Both of you. She will absolutely never, ever hurt you again." Meanwhile, entirely downstairs in the massive, incredibly luxurious grand foyer, a completely different, highly chaotic, utterly humiliating scene was violently unfolding. Exactly 4 massive, incredibly intimidating, highly armed private security guards were standing completely, entirely motionless inside the ultra-luxurious master suite. They were aggressively, silently glaring directly at the completely hysterical, entirely broken Vivian Cole. The highly arrogant, completely elite future billionaire's wife was frantically, violently throwing her incredibly expensive multi-thousand-dollar designer silk dresses directly into cheap, highly abrasive, completely generic brown cardboard moving boxes. "This is absolutely entirely illegal," Vivian shrieked aggressively, her perfectly painted, highly expensive face completely stained with violently running, thick black mascara. "You completely filthy, absolutely disgusting security guards cannot legally touch my incredibly expensive belongings. I am officially his completely gorgeous fiancée," the massive, highly intimidating lead security guard, a former military veteran who had completely zero tolerance for wealthy, highly arrogant tantrums, simply tapped the heavy, highly expensive tactical watch on his thick wrist. "You have exactly 3 completely short minutes left, Miss Cole," he stated violently, his deep, incredibly rough voice completely devoid of any human sympathy. "If you do not completely finish packing your absolutely pathetic bags, we will forcefully, physically drag you entirely out of the massive front doors in exactly what you are completely wearing right now." Vivian wildly, entirely desperately looked around the massive, incredibly luxurious room. Her entire highly calculated, completely elite life was violently, irreparably collapsing into absolute, completely undeniably pathetic ruins. She viciously grabbed her incredibly expensive diamond necklaces, violently shoving them into the cheap cardboard boxes like a desperate, entirely pathetic street criminal running completely from the police. She violently sprinted out of the massive master suite, desperately looking for her elite, highly wealthy best friend. "Chloe!" she screamed aggressively, completely echoing through the massive, pristine hallways. "Chloe, you must absolutely help me. Call your highly expensive lawyers right this exact second." But Chloe, the entirely toxic, highly arrogant heir to the massive shipping fortune, was already violently rushing toward the massive, incredibly heavy front doors of the grand mansion. Chloe had completely, entirely seen the absolutely terrifying, highly deadly look in the billionaire Nathaniel's cold eyes. She deeply, inherently knew that entirely crossing a furious billionaire of his massive, highly intimidating stature would completely, permanently destroy her own wealthy family's empire. "I completely do not absolutely know you, Vivian," Chloe hissed aggressively, violently grabbing her incredibly expensive designer handbag and entirely sprinting directly out the massive front doors toward her cherry red Ferrari. "You are completely on your own, you absolute psycho." The total undeniable betrayal by her closest elite friend completely, entirely shattered Vivian's highly fragile, incredibly arrogant ego. She aggressively collapsed entirely onto the pristine marble floor of the grand foyer, violently sobbing in pure, unadulterated, blinding humiliation. "Your exact 15 minutes are completely up," the lead security guard aggressively announced. 2 massive, incredibly strong guards violently grabbed Vivian Cole entirely by her incredibly expensive, highly tailored silk arms. They aggressively, physically lifted the completely hysterical, entirely screaming elite woman entirely off the floor. They dragged her violently, completely humiliatingly across her beloved pristine marble tiles, entirely ignoring her aggressive, entirely pathetic screams. They violently threw her cheap cardboard boxes directly onto the freezing, completely hard concrete driveway. And then with one final, completely aggressive shove, they violently tossed the arrogant, entirely evil Vivian Cole directly out into the freezing, completely unforgiving night, forcefully slamming the massive, incredibly heavy oak doors entirely shut right in her terrified, completely ruined face. The completely freezing, incredibly unforgiving, violently bitter winter night aggressively swallowed Vivian Cole entirely whole. She stood completely alone, violently shivering in her incredibly expensive, entirely thin silk morning robe on the completely hard, freezing concrete of the massive driveway. The massive, incredibly heavy iron gates of the Brooks estate had violently, permanently slammed shut right in her entirely pathetic, violently tear-stained face. She desperately, aggressively scrambled through her cheap, generic brown cardboard boxes, her perfectly manicured, highly expensive hands shaking violently from the freezing cold and pure, unadulterated terror. She viciously grabbed her highly expensive, completely diamond-encrusted smartphone. She frantically, entirely desperately dialed her incredibly wealthy father, the massive CEO of her elite family's highly lucrative investment firm. The phone rang absolutely only once before her father violently answered, but he was absolutely not checking on his precious, elite daughter. He was screaming violently, completely hysterically at the absolute top of his burning lungs. What the absolute, complete hell did you just violently do, Vivian? Her father roared aggressively, his terrifying, deeply enraged voice completely echoing through the freezing night air. Nathaniel Brooks just personally called me directly from his private security line. He completely violently pulled every single massive multi-billion-dollar investment entirely out of our entire company. He aggressively blacklisted our absolute entire family from every single elite financial institution in the entire country. We are completely, entirely bankrupt. We have absolutely nothing left. You arrogant, entirely stupid girl. I absolutely disown you. Vivian's incredibly expensive smartphone violently slipped entirely from her freezing, completely numb fingers. It hit the freezing concrete and completely irreparably shattered into a massive million tiny worthless pieces, exactly like her entire highly arrogant, completely elite life. She violently collapsed entirely onto the freezing ground, aggressively hugging her cheap cardboard boxes in the freezing dirt. The incredibly terrifying absolute realization violently hit her completely empty soul. She was now entirely, undeniably a part of the exact deeply struggling, completely impoverished lower class that she had so violently, completely despised and viciously tormented. Absolute, undeniable karma had violently, permanently destroyed her entirely. She had absolutely no elite friends, absolutely no multi-million-dollar trust funds, and absolutely no warm, luxurious bed to completely sleep in. She was entirely, absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, completely protected inside the massive, incredibly warm, highly luxurious mansion, the absolute atmosphere had completely, undeniably transformed. The incredibly terrifying, completely suffocating nightmare was entirely, permanently over. The massive, beautiful stone fireplace in the grand living room was roaring aggressively, casting a completely warm, incredibly safe, entirely golden glow entirely across the pristine room. Nathaniel Brooks, the incredibly powerful multi-billionaire titan, was sitting entirely on the expensive, highly comfortable velvet sofa. He was absolutely not acting like a massive, highly intimidating, untouchable CEO. He was gently, incredibly softly holding a completely warm, highly expensive cup of gourmet hot chocolate directly for little Maisie. The beautiful, entirely innocent 3-year-old black child was wrapped completely tightly in an incredibly soft, highly expensive, thick cashmere blanket, completely safe and entirely, absolutely protected. Chef Rosario rushed aggressively entirely out of the massive kitchen, carrying a massive silver tray completely loaded with highly nutritious, incredibly expensive gourmet soup, beautifully roasted vegetables, and warm, freshly baked artisanal bread. He gently, highly respectfully placed it directly in front of DRA on the expensive coffee table. The elderly, incredibly kind Mr. Aber stood highly protectively entirely near the massive doorway, completely ensuring the absolute safety of the fragile, entirely exhausted family. A highly exclusive, incredibly expensive private concierge doctor had arrived completely via a massive emergency helicopter entirely paid for by Nathaniel. The brilliant, highly trained doctor was gently, incredibly carefully cleaning and professionally bandaging DRA's heavily injured, completely raw hands with the absolute best highly advanced medical supplies in the entire world. The blinding absolute agony in DRA's hands was finally, completely starting to gently fade away. DRA looked entirely around the massive, incredibly warm room. Hot, completely uncontrollable tears of absolute, profound gratitude streamed entirely down her highly exhausted, completely battered face. Mr. Brooks, I absolutely do not entirely know how to completely thank you, she whispered softly, her incredibly fragile voice trembling with pure, undeniable, completely overwhelming emotion. You completely, absolutely saved our entire lives tonight. Nathaniel looked directly at her, his incredibly sharp, deeply analytical eyes completely, entirely filled with absolute, undeniable human respect and deep admiration for her incredible strength. You absolutely never ever have to completely thank me for simply treating you like a completely deserving, highly valuable human being, DRA. He stated incredibly firmly, his deep, highly authoritative voice echoing completely safely in the warm room. From this exact, complete second entirely forward, you are absolutely no longer a simple housekeeper. I am officially completely promoting you entirely to the massive position of head estate manager. DRA violently gasped, her incredibly dark eyes completely widening in absolute, complete, undeniable shock. Your absolutely new, highly massive salary will be completely, entirely tripled immediately, Nathaniel continued aggressively, entirely refusing to take absolutely no for an answer. You will receive absolutely full, highly premium medical and dental benefits. And I am personally, completely entirely establishing a massive multi-million-dollar educational trust fund entirely for little Maisie. She will absolutely never, ever have to completely touch a heavy mop or feel entirely invisible in her entire beautiful life. She will go to the absolute best, highly elite universities in the entire world, and I will personally pay for absolutely every single penny. DRA completely broke down, crying violently, entirely uncontrollably into her professionally bandaged hands. It was absolutely not tears of terrible, agonizing pain or complete, freezing terror anymore. It was the incredibly beautiful, absolutely overwhelming, highly purifying tears of pure, undeniable salvation. After spending her entire incredibly difficult life being violently stepped on, entirely humiliated, and completely abused by the elite, highly arrogant upper class, a massive, incredibly powerful billionaire had reached completely entirely down and violently, permanently lifted her entirely out of the terrible, suffocating darkness. Little Maisie, seeing her incredibly brave mother crying, gently reached out her tiny, completely innocent little brown hand and softly patted DRA's heavily bandaged arm. Nathaniel gently smiled, a truly genuine, incredibly warm, absolutely peaceful smile that he had completely not shown in entirely 2 agonizing years. The massive, beautiful Brooks estate was absolutely no longer a terrifying, highly toxic prison, completely controlled by an entirely evil, highly arrogant monster. It was finally, completely, undeniably a true, absolute, highly loving home where entirely true justice had violently, beautifully prevailed. The massive, incredibly bright morning sun officially rose over the breathtaking multi-million-dollar Brooks estate the very next day. bringing an entirely new, completely beautiful era of absolute peace. The suffocating, entirely toxic dark cloud that Vivian Cole had violently brought into the massive mansion was entirely, permanently gone. Inside the warm, incredibly luxurious gourmet kitchen, Chef Rosario was happily, completely joyfully humming a beautiful Italian song as he prepared a massive, incredibly expensive breakfast feast entirely for Dra and little Maisie. The elderly Mr. Aber was outside in the massive, perfectly manicured gardens, carefully picking a completely beautiful, vibrant red rose specifically for the tiny, entirely innocent 3-year-old child. Dra walked slowly, entirely confidently down the sweeping, incredibly high mahogany staircase. She was absolutely no longer wearing the cheap, incredibly worn-out, highly abrasive maid's uniform. She was dressed beautifully, completely professionally in a highly tailored, incredibly elegant dark navy business suit that Nathaniel had personally, entirely ordered for her new massive role as head estate manager. Her heavily bandaged hands were healing incredibly beautifully, entirely protected by the best highly advanced medical care. She held a massive, incredibly sleek leather portfolio, completely ready to entirely manage the massive, highly complex operations of the entire 4-acre estate. Little Maisie was happily, completely safely sitting directly at the massive, highly expensive marble kitchen island. She was entirely surrounded by beautiful, highly colorful new coloring books and massive, incredibly expensive boxes of the absolute best crayons in the entire world. When Nathaniel walked directly into the massive kitchen, dressed impeccably, entirely flawlessly in his expensive morning suit, little Maisie immediately dropped her beautiful red crayon. She ran completely happily, entirely safely across the pristine marble floor and hugged his massive, highly powerful legs. Nathaniel smiled completely warmly, entirely genuinely, gently patting the little girl's head before sitting down to deeply, entirely discuss the massive estate budget directly with his brilliant, highly capable new manager Dra. But entirely across the massive city, in the absolutely freezing, completely unforgiving, highly impoverished outskirts of Atlanta, a completely different, absolutely devastating, entirely miserable reality was violently unfolding. The incredibly arrogant, formerly elite Vivian Cole was completely, entirely unrecognizable. She was standing violently shivering in a massive, incredibly long, highly depressing line outside a completely run-down, entirely desolate employment agency. Her highly expensive, beautifully tailored designer silk morning robe had been violently traded for a cheap, completely worn-out, heavily stained oversized winter coat she had desperately, entirely pathetically found at a local charity donation bin. Her perfectly contoured, highly expensive makeup was entirely, completely washed away, revealing a heavily exhausted, deeply sunken, entirely miserable face that had violently aged 10 agonizing years in a single completely terrifying night. She desperately, entirely aggressively clutched a cheap, completely crumpled paper resume in her freezing, completely bare hands. Every single elite, highly wealthy corporation in the entire country had aggressively, permanently blacklisted her entire, utterly disgraced family. Her incredibly wealthy, massive CEO father was entirely facing massive, highly complex federal bankruptcy charges after Nathaniel violently, aggressively pulled his massive, multi-billion-dollar investments. Vivian finally, completely exhaustedly reached the front of the massive line. The incredibly bored, highly overworked clerk behind the completely dirty, entirely scratched plexiglass window looked directly at her pathetic, entirely empty resume. "I am incredibly sorry," the clerk stated entirely flatly, completely devoid of any human sympathy. With absolutely zero verifiable work history and a severely terrible, highly negative reference from the massive Brooks organization, The absolutely only position we entirely have available for you is a massive, incredibly heavy-duty overnight janitorial shift at the massive city bus terminal. You will absolutely have to use a massive, incredibly heavy industrial mop to entirely scrub the completely filthy public restrooms. A massive, completely suffocating, entirely undeniable wave of absolute, terrifying cosmic irony violently crashed entirely over Vivian Cole's completely broken soul. The absolute, unadulterated karma of the universe had violently, permanently delivered its completely flawless, highly poetic justice. She was now entirely forced to aggressively, desperately perform the exact same agonizing, completely humiliating physical labor she had so viciously, entirely sadistically forced upon a tiny, completely innocent 3-year-old child. She slowly, entirely defeatedly took the cheap paper application, completely weeping in pure, absolute, blinding humiliation as she violently, entirely recognized the absolute, inescapable gravity of her massive sins. Months entirely turned into completely beautiful, highly prosperous years. Little Maisie grew up completely entirely surrounded by immense, absolute love, profound, undeniable safety, and incredibly elite, highly expensive educational opportunities. She eventually entirely brilliantly graduated at the absolute top of her incredibly elite high school class. And when she confidently, entirely proudly walked directly across the massive, highly prestigious university stage to receive her incredibly difficult, highly complex medical degree, a massively proud, completely gray-haired billionaire named Nathaniel Brooks was sitting entirely in the absolute front row, aggressively cheering the loudest. Dra sat completely happily right beside him, her completely healed hands gently holding a massive, incredibly beautiful bouquet of fresh red roses. Meanwhile, Vivian Cole remained entirely trapped in a completely inescapable, highly agonizing cycle of extreme, undeniable poverty, entirely scrubbing massive, incredibly filthy floors for the absolute rest of her miserable, entirely pathetic existence, completely haunted by the terrifying ghost of the massive empire she violently destroyed with her own incredibly toxic arrogance. I need you to completely stop whatever you are absolutely doing right this exact second and look entirely deep within your own absolute moral compass. If you were the massive, incredibly powerful billionaire Nathaniel, and you walked completely unexpectedly into that massive kitchen to see your elite, highly connected fiancé violently abusing a poor, completely defenseless minority child, what would you have entirely done? Would you have absolutely, completely sacrificed your massive, highly strategic elite marriage to completely protect the entirely invisible, deeply struggling lower class? Or would you have entirely, completely turned a blind eye, secretly silencing the poor maid just to peacefully maintain your perfect, highly curated elite public image? You are absolutely standing at the exact moral crossroads right now. I completely demand that you drop your entirely honest, completely raw truth directly in the comments right this exact second. If you believe that true, absolute, entirely undeniable karma was completely served today, you absolutely must hit that massive like and subscribe button entirely immediately.